All right, welcome back to the Epic Web3 podcast. My name is Alex. I'm CEO and co-founder of Epic Web3. As always, we make events for Web3 builders. Our next event is in Dubai during Token 24. See you all there. And today, my guest is Anurag Arjun, founder of Avail, modular blockchain base layer. Anurag, welcome to the show.
Yep. Thank you, Alex. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, you can see I'm prepared. I'm wearing a Avail DA t-shirt. Do you know what is in the back of it?
I think it's when mainnet.
Yeah, when mainnet exactly. So my first question is when mainnet.
Yeah. Avail DA is slated to be in mainnet sometime in April.
Sometime in April. Okay,
Yeah.
really soon.
Very
I
soon.
think this pod will be released in April, so not too long to wait. So I would like to start with asking about your background. So you were one of the co-founders of Polygon, right? So could you tell me a little bit about your role there?
Yep. Yeah. So I entered crypto back in 2017 when I founded Polygon, which was known as Matic Network. When we started, right? Like we basically three of us, me, Jayanti, and Sandeep. The three of us started Polygon in 2017 in India, in Mumbai, actually, in a very small co-working space, only the three of us. And then at that time, like it was pretty early, right? Like Ethereum's, we actually started working on this plasma scaling solution. So before rollups, there was a plasma approach to scaling Ethereum. And so that is when we got started. 2017 was around the time when Ethereum was facing some congestion problems and such, for example. And so the Plasma white paper had come out, and we were wanting to be one of the first teams to implement Plasma. Of course, a lot of things changed over the years. We eventually ended up not being able to implement Plasma because it was unworkable. A lot of problems around that, but of course, rollups came into the picture. But we actually built Polygon POS. So like in general, 2020 was when we actually released it. And so yeah, over the years, I've been in doing a lot of work around Plasma, around POS, around bridging, around like crafting the ZK strategy. Been involved in acquiring all the ZK teams that Polygon eventually acquired, like Maiden, Zero, Hermes, for example, and so on. So yeah, I was doing a lot of stuff there at Polygon until 2023. In 2020, actually, what happened is once we released Polygon POS, we were actually looking for what to do next in general, defining the next goals of the company, of the project. And Rollups had recently come into the picture, released its rollup centric roadmap plan as well in 2020. And so that was the time we got to seriously thinking on what to do next. And so, of course, on the execution side, we moved to ZK rollups. And as you can see, Polygon released the ZK EVM last year, for example, and there's a bunch of activity happening there. But in 2020, actually, we also started Avail within Polygon. And so we've been working on Avail since the last 3.5 years, because we knew that rollups were going to be a major part of blockchain's future of scaling execution. And like if you look at from it from that point of view, right? Like so we kind of course, where we are coming from a very infrastructure point of view, right? Like so we've thought of what infrastructure roll-up centric world of blockchains would really look, right? Like so, and roll-ups are actually not that complicated in that sense. They are basically computation that is verifiable computation done off chain, right? Like so, you take so on a base layer like Ethereum, for example, you have smart contracts that are like verified by the logic of the chain, right? Like so you have a number of nodes that do these re-execute, and then they verify whether something is correct or not, right? Like so in general, like when you want to kind of scale more, right? Like and so rollups was found to be a better way to kind of do execution of the chain and then push some data back to the base layer so that you can reconstruct the state, for example, and so on, right? Like so So in general, like when rollups started coming into the flow, we realized one thing, right? Like so Plasma was also one sort of off-chain scaling solution that didn't work out, but rollups were much more promising. What really rollups enable, I think, which most people don't really maybe don't appreciate that much, is before rollups came into the picture, the cost of spinning up a new chain was immense, right? Like if you want to do a L1, for example, you have to, of course, write the software, but also then bootstrap a validator set. You also need to have a token that needs to be valuable to have enough cryptoeconomic security, for example. If when you have the token, you also need to create a big community, for example. So there's a lot of work in kind of spinning up a new chain, right? Like so, and that's why you'll see a lot of L1 chains not having enough security budget, for example, right? Like if you look at a lot of the Cosmos chains, for example, and others, right? Like it's difficult, right? Like, and so what rollups, of course, they provided a way to scale execution or computation of the base blockchain, but they also provide this very nice flexibility of not really requiring validator bootstrapping or security bootstrapping, because any rollup built on top of a secure base layer inherits the security in that sense, right? Like so, and so you don't need to now developers who are doing this rollup don't need to think about validator set bootstrapping or like as such, right? Like they don't need to worry about security. And so what that really means is they are able to now experiment with bringing new execution environments, bringing new ways of like authentication mechanisms. Users, you can actually build rollups with no gas metering, for example, in general, right? Like you can actually experiment with this because these changes are not on the base layer; they are on a layer on top, and you can actually do a lot of flexibility there. And so essentially, the point I'm coming to is that, like we knew that rollups would be massive. There would be many kinds of rollups, not only the EVM rollups, there will be a lot of non-EVM rollups, WASM rollups, Cairo rollups, TypeScript rollups, RIS0 rollups, and so on, right? Like, and so essentially, what infrastructure do you need to enable these rollups, right? Like, so that was the main point. And so we started with the scalable DA play in the sense because rollups require scalable DA to or data availability to kind of enable them at scale. And so that we found the opportunity to kind of build this solution. And so Avail DA is like the scalable DA layer with which is built with something called KZG polynomial commitments and validity proof based data availability sampling and so on. But this is basically similar primitives that are going to be used on what Ethereum wants to do on its what is called the dank sharding roadmap in general. So Avail DA really is this blockchain that is built for rollups in general. So okay, I'm getting into a lot of detail here, but this is was kind of the motivation that start when we started building Avail. But in and then of course we've now also last year we started to build on things like Avail Nexus and Avail Fusion, which we just announced at Denver a few weeks back, for example. And these are all things that would enable infrastructure that is required for enabling this rollup centric feature. So that's the point of Avail, right? Like so, um, and just quickly for just from context, right? Like in March 2023 last year, we decided to spin out of Polygon, like establish Avail as a separate entity. And so we did that last year, and we are now waiting to launch our first production mainnet on Avail DA, and Nexus and Fusion will follow in the coming months.
Thanks for this explanation. I will definitely dive deeper into the details of how Avail DA works and everything. But first, so why did you decide to spin off completely and to create a separate company? Why didn't you continue to develop it inside Polygon?
Yeah. So as I said, right, like so Avail is infrastructure for all rollups, right? Like I mean, it's not necessarily that we are building for Polygon rollups or like any particular project, right? Like it's for ZK Sync rollups, it's for Starkware rollups, for Arbitrum rollups, Optimism rollups, Sovereign Labs rollups, Stacker rollups, any rollup infrastructure, right? Like, and so we wanted to kind of ensure structurally that like we are a credibly neutral layer in that sense, right? Like we don't want to be playing favorites or siding with any one project, right? Like we are here to kind of enable rollups at scale and connect rollups at scale, and so this requires us to be in a position where we are not looked at as biased, right? Like that was, I think, one of the primary reasons. Also, it was that if you look at Polygon, right? Like it's very much like if you look at the product suite at Polygon, right? Like it's at some point in time we used to have 9 products at Polygon. So if you look at it's Polygon POS, Edge, Supernets, then Zero, Hermes, Maiden, Avail, and Polygon ID, for example. So this is like a lot of products in general, and it's difficult even if like Polygon is now a big company, right? Like it's still very much like a operates like a startup, right? Like I mean, it's of course not like a typical small startup, but it's still not like it's difficult to manage like a very big product suite within one company, right? Like, and so we wanted Avail to live in its own organization so that all people on the organization focus on Avail's welfare. So it's also an organizational thing, right? Like I mean,
Yeah.
it's just better to manage it independently.
Is Polygon still a major stakeholder?
No, actually, we essentially bought out all the Avail IP from Polygon, and so me, my fellow co-founder Prabal, so who was leading research at Polygon. So we actually bought out all the IP, and so at the moment there is no Polygon ownership at the moment.
No ownership at all. So you like
Yeah,
bought out the company.
yeah, yeah.
Nice. And and you recently announced that you raised a 27 million seed. So that's massive. And first of all, congrats with that. So what do you think helped you raise a big amount of money from prominent? I don't know, your background, or was it vision or network or all of it?
Yeah, so of course, I mean, I'll not lie that background certainly helps. The fact that I, like built out Polygon, a company, like project like Polygon before, so that certainly helps. But that's not enough, really, right? Like you also have to be, creating products that are really required in the next, like you, and essentially when you're building a project, right? Like you're building for the future, right? Like I mean, essentially, of course, you do some things that are required right now, and then you need to anticipate things that you will need in the future, right? Like so what we essentially stand for is that rollups are going to be huge and you need infrastructure to run these rollups at scale, to connect these rollups at scale. And the articulation of our vision and the products that we are working on, like Avail DA, Nexus Fusion. And if you look at Avail DA, right, really, when we actually raised our initial seed round, right, like, I mean, it was it was like a fully functioning network that was already almost ready, right? Like, I mean, essentially, and it's not like it's a small task. Like, if you kind of look at the architecture deeply, like maybe the viewers can look at our blogs and docs for more details. But we essentially have built out this validator based network, which is the Avail DA base layer, but also this network of light clients, data ready sampling light clients, which is a separate network in itself, right? Like, and so this doing both of this together in and having it ready for launch in at this point in time, right? Like that itself is a big thing. But of course, that is like just the starting point of our vision, right? Like I mean, what we want to do is of course enable rollups at scale via the scalable DLA, but we also want to then, because like essentially if you end up having a number of rollups, right? Like you're moving into rollup fragmentation or UX fragmentation, right? Like I mean, how can users think about so many chains, right? Like, I mean, you have to think about switching RPCs, bridging tokens from one to another. And so there's a lot of complexity there, right? Like, and so of course we solve the scalable DA problem or, like rollup scalability problem, but the vision is to kind of solve or kind of take these fragmented rollups and think of ways to unify them, right? Like, and so that's really what we are aiming for, and I think it's sufficiently ambitious vision, considering that like the rollup revolution is kind of starting already. We already, I think, probably north of 100 rollups are in production or going to production, and so this is going to be sorely needed, right? Like, and so I would say it's a combination of background, the kind of work that we've already done on the project, but also like ambition and vision.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, makes sense. So you already briefly described the vision behind the veil, and part of it is that there will be thousands of rollups, and they all need to be interconnected, interoperate, right? But let me ask, so why do we need so many rollups? I heard that like in the future, probably each dApp will have its own rollup, its own, I don't know, app chain, right? So why is it even needed in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's a good, valid question. And maybe I'll take an analogy about how apps on the internet have exhibited, like how they have evolved over the years, right? Like, so if you kind of look at apps on the internet, apps on the internet do not run on one big supercomputer, right? Like, I mean, they run on separate servers, separate microservices, and each service is or app is like independently scalable, right? Like, I mean, depending upon demand, right? Like, so for example, Facebook will run the Facebook app runs on like huge number of servers, and they independently scale them as we go, right? Like a startup app that is just started, for example, will start off on one single server, for example, right? Like, and so essentially, like if you look at that landscape, right, like you have these different pockets. Like if you look at the idea of computation, right, like so this is really apps are doing some sort of computation, like whether it be Facebook, whether it's some financial application, social application, gaming application, they're doing some computation, and each of them rely on like different, like owning their own infra, right? Like, I mean, of course, a lot of people use the cloud today, but like even on the cloud, right, like it's renting out, let's say, servers, ways you can like abstract that as well, but essentially everyone has their own some sort of virtual dedicated space, right? Like, and because each app has its own requirement in general and wants to scale independently of the others, right? Like, it should not be that there's so much activity on some app and it like affects the UX of the other apps on the chain, for example, right? Like, so broadly speaking, like if you look at how blockchains have evolved, right? Like, so there are these chains that where you kind of increase the throughput on one single chain, and then you have like something like the rollup architecture where there is one base layer but a lot of rollups on top, right? Like, and there are some EVM rollups, but these app specific rollups, for example, have the tooling for that is still under development. So we have not seen enough of those. But you can look at chains like DYDX, for example, or Immutable X in the Starkware ecosystem, who have been already doing this, right? Like, so the idea is how can we kind of separate application demand between these chains and like, allow them to independently scale, right? Like, so that's how apps on the internet have historically evolved, and we feel that it's going to be the same, right? Like, I mean, so if you look at, let's say, something like an Amazon, right? Like when you go to Amazon and try to purchase something, right? Like, so when you click on the buy button, uh, it it actually, when you get back the payment button, right? Like what is happening in the backend is that you're hitting the buy button. It's the Amazon server is making a call to the Visa server or the Stripe server, for example, and then like so these services are running on totally different machines and infrastructure in general, right? Like the front end on the front end, people don't really know, right? Like they're just using Amazon. But in the backend, there's a lot of complexity happening, a lot of different services running. And the point is like blockchain infra is going to get to this point, right? Like it's not there today, but there's going to be a lot of different stuff happening in the backend, and the user just will access it through a front end, right? Like, but to enable a lot of these things to happen, right? Like, so it's essentially, like you in computing terminology, you generally call this as vertical scaling and horizontal scaling, right? Like, so vertical scaling is if you increase the resources required to, like compute something, for example, or do there's a vertical scaling technique, and horizontal scaling is, like when you do a lot of different cores, adding more cores to the problem, for example, and so on, right? Like, so it's how historically computation has evolved, not only in blockchains but in other places, and so we think it's going to be the same, right? Like, that doesn't mean that so there will be like experiments on how to do horizontal scaling, how to do vertical scaling, and so we think rollups. Our biased opinion is that, like, rollups are going to follow the microservices or the different services route, right? Like, so that's our hypothesis.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, that's probably the best explanation I've heard so far. So the vision is there will be thousands of rollups, all connected to Veil DA in like the end game, the ideal end game. How many data availability layers will be there? So if there will be thousands of rollups, 3, 5, 10 data availability layers. How do you compete with how will you compete with others because yeah, there are quite a few companies now building kind of something similar.
Yeah. So our hypothesis is that there's a lot of scalable DA throughput that is being built. I would say probably, I mean, there's a lot of projects doing DA, but only some do it properly, right? Like, I mean, essentially, when you want to DA or data availability is not necessarily a very new thing, right? Like, I mean, all blockchains have DA, data availability by default, right? Like, Bitcoin has data availability by default, Ethereum has data availability by default, right? Like, it's a blockchain characteristic, right? Like, so data availability itself is not a new construct, right? Like, what is new really is how do you kind of verify data availability quickly, right? Like, or succinctly, right? Like, so before you needed to run a full node for, to verify DA. That is, you need to download all the transactional data and then basically be full guarantee that the data is available or the transaction data is available, right? Like, this is actually, I also want to kind of reiterate that the data, when we talk about data availability, right? Like, this data is not necessarily like application data or such, right? Like, this is primarily things like transactional data, and data availability is a very different problem than data storage, right? Like, so data storage solutions really don't provide any data availability per se, like in a sense that, of course, if you run a full node, everything is a data availability layer, but what really you differentiates is, you have to be able to verify data availability, and data availability is actually an ordering guarantee in general, right? Like, I mean, in ordering in blockchains is very important. So when you actually send transactions to a blockchain, some stakeholder, like a block producer, for example, or so on, orders the transactions, and then basically there's verification, consensus, and so on. Now, that ordering is very important because if the ordering is changed, right, like, and that's what people do in things like MEV and so on, right? Like, that changes the end result, right? Like, so you can think of data availability as more like an ordering solution for, so rollups do the execution off chain, but data availability layers do the ordering. And so now what these newer data availability solutions like Avail, for example, bring to the fore is how can we do more efficiently verify whether the data availability or the ordering is correct, right? Like, and so that's the superpower that, like Avail brings, with especially with data availability sampling, right? Like, um, and that is going to be very important in a world where if there are going to be these thousands of or millions of rollups, how are these going to talk to each other? Like, and so what we really need is things like execution proof aggregation and data ordering guarantees, for example, and combine this to what we create some, like called something called Avail Nexus, which is what, like is infrastructure for connecting these rollups together. And the way we look at it is, right, like I go back to that Amazon problem, Amazon example, is that, like, if you kind of think of it, right, like when you are getting a page from Amazon and clicking on the buy button, right? Like, the Visa microservice comes back with the payment page, and then you put in your details and it validates your payment, for example, and so on. So if all of this are in the computing term, right? Like these are all asynchronous microservices, in the sense that they are not connected to each other at all times, right? Like so, whenever a user on Amazon clicks on the buy button, that is when a call gets sent to the Visa server, for example, and then whenever that thing is ready, when the payment is validated, for example, it takes some time, and then a response goes back, right? Like so, essentially, these are all asynchronous microservices, and it's not like everything is connected to everything. Like Amazon talks to Visa all the time, right? Like it's basically independent microservices, and whenever it is required, they will talk to each other. So that's change in architecture or thinking that we want to bring through is that you don't need smart contracts to be on the same chain all the time, right? Like of course, in some cases it's good, but a lot of services will be on demand, right? Like you call them whenever you want, right? Like if you want to do a payment via an Amazon, make a call to the Visa server. Similarly, if you are on, let's say, like some application on one chain, and it's not necessarily to be talking to the other chain continuously. Whenever you require, you make a call, right? Like, and so that connection of that rollups, that is what we aim to make it trust minimized, right? Like that is really the end goal, right?
Yeah, makes sense. I'm not sure. So there will be. Do you think there will be several different data availability layers solving different solutions, or there will be, I don't know, one winner takes it all, or
I think,
what?
yeah,
Yeah, what will this ecosystem look like?
I think to be very fair, like if you look at it from a purely economic point of view, like there is bunch of good DA solutions that are coming to market, or already in market, and so there's a lot of capacity that is being brought into the market, and so my our thinking is that DA is going to be commoditized. Like it's going to
Okay.
be table stakes for any player to play in blockchain, right? Like in general, like DA is going to be so readily available, inexpensive that in general, of course, like there's going to be some sort of mindshare battle, BD battle, and so on. So some chains will go to this DA layer, some chains will go to that DA layer, for example. But it really, I don't think an inexpensive DA layer, like low cost DA, is going to be a differentiator, right? Like, I mean, every DA layer is going to have that, like, like other than Ethereum, for example, right? Like, so if you focus on just providing low cost DA, then it's not going to be enough, right? Like, I mean, because everyone is be able to provide lower cost in that sense, right? Like, so lower cost is never a differentiator, like unless you're like running that as a business. So essentially, DA, we feel that DA is going to be commoditized, right? Like the real value is what do you do? Like you of course enable a lot of rollups at scale. What can you provide on top of this, right? Like I mean, and that's our play with Avail, Nexus, and Fusion, right? Like I mean, like of course we enable scalable DA for like enabling rollups at scale, but the end vision is to be able to provide this substrate that unifies all these rollups together, right? Like so that they seem like one entity. Like at the end goal is that you have a wallet, you have a user with a wallet. The user says, I want to do some XYZ things on these chains. And the wallet should be able to kind of talk to Avail Nexus, for example, and then Avail Nexus takes care of what to do, right? Like, I mean, user doesn't have to think about RPCs or, like things like that, right? Like, I mean, to bridging and stuff like that. It's like that Amazon example, as again, right? Like, the user doesn't need to think about all the complexity, what is behind what is happening, right? So at this moment, like blockchain infrastructure is not that. It's a very power user led user experience, right? Like you need to know how to use things like MetaMask, you need to know how to switch RPCs, bridge tokens, and so on. And if you want to really get to like a lot of mainstream users, what you will need to do is abstract out the complexity. And abstracting out the complexity in blockchains is not as easy, let's say, in traditional web applications, because you also have to maintain this trust minimization properties. And so that's really the effort behind Avail Nexus, for example, right? Like, I mean, that's why we are making a big push towards it, because we feel that DA is going to be going to get boring, like in 6 months to a year, because there's just going to be too much DA, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. What do you think of a chain abstraction concept? So, are you also following to the state where aiming to the state where the user even doesn't know what chain he interacts or she interacts
I think
with?
that is the end outcome that we certainly want, right? Like, so chain abstraction can mean a few things, right? Like, so there are there's some framework, like I think Near has been pushing this chain abstraction framework, for example, right? Like, so that is a slightly different way of getting at it, right? Like, so that is saying that user will have accounts that can sign transactions on multiple chains, for example, and so on, right? Like, so the user doesn't need to handle multiple accounts, for example, on each chain. So that is, and there are other teams bringing that. But if you kind of take chain abstract like chain abstraction, the term literally, right? Like, so it literally means that okay, there are these so many chains, and users don't really need to understand the differences between them and so on, right? Like, and so this is going to be a combination of what we are doing at Avail Nexus, where we are kind of unifying these rollups with a trust minimization framework, but also working with wallets and intent layers, like let's say, like Near's model or any other project's model, right? Like, which abstracts on the account side, right? Like, so you have to abstract chains away, but you also have to abstract, let's say, user wallets or accounts, for example, right? Like, so it's going to be a combination of these things, right? Like, none of it doesn't work with only one, for example. So there's a lot of work left to do on all of this, but yeah, the end goal is how can we get to a level where chains kind of get abstracted.
Yeah, and also we had a podcast with Polygon recently, and we talked a lot about Aglair they are building. So how do you definitely know about it? How do you think Veil Nexus, Veil ecosystem will work together with it? So I don't know. Are those kind of competitive vision or complementary vision? So what do you think of it?
Yeah, I would like to think of these as complementary visions, right? Like, essentially, from what I understand of Polygon Aglair, and I may be wrong with the recent, like improvements in general, is that there's going to be these aggregated proofs from Polygon CDK chains that are going to be there, but there's also this cross-chain coordination infra that are building that enables other chains also to opt in, for example, right? Like, and what Avail Nexus really does is it works with like the Polygon Aglair system. ZK Sync also has like an hyperchain aggregation plan, proof aggregation plan, for example, aggregation initiative, for example. Optimism has a super chain initiative. Arbitrum has a orbit initiative, right? Like, so how we feel about this is that there are all these nice L2 teams that are like very talented, very well capitalized, that are building like very nice frameworks and building their own ecosystem, right? Like, I mean, in general. And so it's like I heard this on somewhere last week. Is this thing? It's like almost like every player here is kind of like trying to build this mini empire within the Ethereum ecosystem, right? Like, and so of course, each of these teams are very talented, and they want to pursue or imprint their vision of what they want to do into the world, right? Like, and so there's nothing wrong with that, because Ethereum itself is a very unopinionated base layer, and so you can actually build all of these on much more. A lot of other teams I didn't mention are also kind of doing like Scroll, Tyco, Linea, for example, and others, right? Like, so the how we think about this is that there's a bunch of mini empires that are being built, right? Like, and so the idea is how can we offer a framework which is trust minimized to enable all these ecosystems to come together for the Ethereum ecosystem, right? Like, I mean, that's really the intent, right? Like, I mean, I think Polygon Aglier is also it's a pretty cool design as well, and there are elements that are slight overlaps there. But the idea is that like we want to. I think this is perfectly complementary with what we are doing, and I think we should be working with Aglier also significantly in the coming days.
Good, good. When do you think this Avail Nexus, this interoperability layer, will be live?
So I think we are actually planning to release our Nexus testnet in Q3 this year. Hopefully in Q2 we want to release an early prototype that showcases connecting a ZK Sync chain with a Polygon ZK EVM chain. But in Q3 is when we anticipate like the first testnet and mainnet of Nexus should follow after that.
When when all the rollups, or I don't know, many rollups are connected to this Avail Nexus layer, does it mean they, as I understood, it doesn't mean they share the liquidity, right? So they are interoperable, but they don't share the liquidity.
Yeah, I mean, see, essentially, you can think of, see, like, essentially, you can think of these as, like, as I said, right? Like, there are these different ecosystems that are developing, and we don't interfere too much with that, right? Like, I mean, we let that ecosystem enable, right? Like, I mean, it's going to do in any case, right? Like, because that's what they are pushing. And but like you think about the user experience of a user, let's say who's logged into, for example, like let's say certain ecosystems, let's say the Optimism superchain, for example, right? Like or any other ecosystem. Now within that ecosystem, the experience of a user is great, but what if they want to bridge from that ecosystem to others, right? Like what when they access the liquidity from others, right? Like so essentially, because we focus on connecting these chains asynchronously. I mean, you can enable some sort of synchronous behavior as well, not getting into that. But because you kind of tap into this, right? Like you can, of course, also, I mean, liquidity also comes along with free in general, right? Like, I mean, you can think of this as like if you are, I don't know whether you've used Venmo a lot in like it's prevalent in the US, but like I mean any sort of wallet that is there, right? Like I mean in the traditional web ecosystem, right? Like so what happens is when you want to like use Venmo in the US, right? Like you have to top up like when you're creating a new Venmo account, you have to top up that account with some funds from your credit card or from your bank account, and then you kind of can do seamless transfers within that ecosystem, right? Like I mean that's kind of the design pattern there. Now, it doesn't really require liquidity. Like, Venmo users don't really require liquidity for all transactions, right? Like, it's just when I want to top up, I want an access to the bank or the credit card, for example. When I want to withdraw, I want an access, right? Like, I mean, I think basically what will happen is we just need to lay the pipes for this behavior. You will kind of enable these kind of behaviors already. Like so liquidity can flow on demand, right? Like I mean that's really what we want to build for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And you are starting with supporting ZK rollups, right? So not optimistic ones to start.
Currently, yes, I will say the focus is a lot on ZK rollups for the moment. We are also actually working on a design for including optimistic rollups as well. We have to do a little bit of work there. We know what to do there, but yes, optimistic rollup support will also be added.
Do you think that the future is ZK, or will there be both concept?
I think it will depend upon a lot of things. Like, of course, ZK Tech. I'm biased on ZK Tech, for example, in general, but ZK also is a little bit newer, right? Like so, there's a lot of code, freshly written code that has been written. So it has to do more battle testing. So that's one thing. Second thing is also it can be a little bit expensive compared to optimistic rollups. Like optimistic rollups don't have to run provers, for example, and so on. Optimistic rollups also, I think, are going to adopt. ZK technology in terms of, like ZK fraud proofs, for example, or just running a ZK prover themselves, for example. And so I think for the near to medium term, I think we are going to see both of them have a lot of activity. But I think once ZK proving costs, for example, go significantly down, the code is much better battle tested. I think like people will transition to ZK rollups because it just simplifies the surface area a lot, right? Like, and I don't know if most people know, right? Like if you look at let's say even Arbitrum, for example, right? Like so the founders of Arbitrum, if you look in their backgrounds, they've done a fair bit of research work on ZK and validity proofs before deciding to start on Arbitrum, for example. So I mean, it doesn't. I don't think the people in the space, like are maximalist in terms of like what technology to stick to in general, right? Like I mean, they whatever is feasible now, what is usable now, that is what most people will start building, for example, and then using. But it's I think if something like a like if ZK tech really is applicable to Arbitrum chains, for example, I don't see any reason why leaders in let's say Arbitrum and Optimism won't want to use it. For example, I think Optimism already has some research or projects underway to explore ZK fraud proofs and such, for example.
Yeah. What about other L1s, non-EVM based L1s? Do you think Val Nexus is gonna support them?
Our focus right now is, of course, on rollups because, of course, there's just a lot of work to do. In theory, the architecture can support other L1s as well. What we've done over the last year is we've kind of built out support for a lot of consensus, like ZK consensus verifiers or lightlands, which help us to verify the consensus on these chains. And so in theory, yes, we should be able to kind of connect L1 chains depending upon whether there's consensus verification and proof verification and so on. But our focus right now is more on rollups, and then, but yeah, in theory, yes, it could be used to connect L1 chains as well.
I also wanted to ask a couple of questions about data availability sampling.
Mhm.
So you mentioned that it's one of uh, the things you are doing right. So
Mm.
first of all, can you briefly describe what does it mean and why do we need it?
So, like going back to basics, right? Like, what is data availability? Right? Like I said, like I mean, so this is the data in data availability, like primarily, like points to things like transaction data more than data storage, for example, right? Like so, but essentially we take ideas from computing, like erasure coding, for example, right? Like so, if you think of erasure coding, right? Like what is erasure coding? So if you've ever handled a compact disk or a hard drive, for example, right? Like so, essentially, so designers or like people who build this technology don't really kind of when you write data onto a compact disk or a hard drive, right? Like they don't just put the data as is. They kind of do this erasure coding thing. It's a mathematical technique that kind of doubles, like basically makes your data redundant, right? Like I mean, it writes it multiple times, but it doesn't write it like side by side, right? Like there's a like a mathematical calculation that goes behind it. But essentially, why is it important, right? Like if you kind of think of this compact disk problem or compact disk, right? Like maybe there is a scratch on the compact disk, right? Like and it the data that you have stored actually gets rubbed away by the scratch, right? Like you need to ensure that that doesn't happen, right? Like and so that's why you do things like erasure coding, which kind of distributes this data or makes it redundant and also puts it in some other place. So even if the your data gets deleted by the scratch on the compact disk, it is also available in some other place. And so basically you are able to kind of, and like there's a lot more complexity than I'm just trying to say, but I just want to keep it simple, is that you are able to retrieve that data even if only 51% of the data is available, for example. It's a mathematical technique in that sense. And so So how we basically use that with combination with things like commitments and sampling is that so we have rollups writing data to Avail DA. That data is taken. It is erasure coded by this whole mathematical detail, and it is basically like we create something called a 2D matrix. Like not getting into too much details, but essentially it is kept in a format where a light line, which is separate from this, can actually do some sampling, right? Like it asks for some samples. Like it will say, give me, okay, we have this like matrix, like let's say 64 by 64, or maybe 4 cross 4 matrix, for example. And then it will say, oh, give me one cell from row one, column two, for example, or like row three, column four, for example. And so, and if you have one light line doing this, and you have, let's say, 10 clients, 50 clients, 100 different clients doing this together. And basically, the awesome thing there is that if we have enough number of light clients, and this can be in the tens and hundreds, though you don't require there to be millions of these, is that you are able to kind of quickly verify whether the data is available by the samplings. So if you have, like, let's say, a reasonable number of light clients, like you can actually get this guarantee within eight eight samples, 10 samples, 12 samples, and it's happening very fast. So in general, the other way, the previous way was to kind of run a full node and then like download all the data, which is going to take a lot of time. Here you have distribute this to a lot of agents, for example, or light clients, and then they quickly sample. And that's really like it sounds simple, but in general, the technology behind it is involves a lot of lip P2P work, for example, required us to rewrite a lot of the code, for example, and so on. So that's really like some of the magic behind Avail DA.
Yeah, nice. Is it what you called validity proof implementation, or is it something else?
Yeah, so essentially, so to implement data availability sampling, right, like, and for the data availability guarantee, right, like you can use two or three different ways to kind of arrive at these guarantees. So one is, of course, like a pessimistic guarantee is that you download all the data. Then there is an optimistic guarantee that you optimistically assume everything is correct, but you have some sort of fraud-proof challenge window. That is what something like like a Celestia uses. It uses this optimistic fraud-proof challenge window mechanism, which is similar to how optimistic rollups have this 7-day challenge period in general. Well, DA does this via validity proofs, right? Like, I mean, so the validators create these commitments, and then you can generate proofs almost immediately. So, and this is kind of the same similar technology that like Ethereum wants to use on its Dank sharding roadmap, right? Like, so we chose that for a reason that this is going to be the technology that is going to be what is going to be used in the future in general, and so it's just much more fast and scalable to use this rather than like optimistic schemes.
Nice, nice. And I also heard of one dimension sampling and two-dimensional sampling. So can you briefly describe
Yeah, these
this?
are just various different ways to do this. Like, I mean, so we do what is called 2D, like a 2D matrix, for example. And so essentially, so we don't do 1D, we do 2D.
Yeah. Uh, I think it's time to wrap up. Is probably everybody is waiting for airdrops and tokens. Yeah, just kidding. Yeah, I'm sure there will be mainnet soon, and all this. So yeah, we didn't have time to talk about the third part of your Avail Trinity, which is Avail Fusion, the security layer. But yeah, it was really interesting talking to you. Maybe you'd like to add something in the end.
Yeah, I mean, just to complete the picture, right? Like the Avail Trinity also constitutes of Avail Fusion. What Avail Fusion is really additive cryptoeconomic security. So essentially, because we are a new protocol and we want to ensure that we have more and more cryptoeconomic security earlier. So we use, of course, the Avail native token to power the Avail base layer. But the idea with Avail Fusion is to kind of also enable staking in other assets like BTC, like ETH, for example, on the Avail base layer at a future point in time, so that we can add more crypto economic security through these tokens, right? Like, so you can think of this as like a, like people as a consumer of things like restaked ETH or BTC, for example, right? Like where they want to kind of provide security to. So it helps improve, like the entire architecture, because we are able to get more crypto economic security. Because if we are going to build this layer that kind of unifies all these rollups on top, we also need the base layer to be extremely secure in terms of cryptographic security. So that's really the vision that we are going behind, right? Like, I mean, the Avail DA enables a lot of rollups on top. Avail Nexus then kind of builds or connects these rollups together in a trust minimized manner, and Avail Fusion strengthens the foundation of Avail by providing more cryptographic security. So that's really what the overall vision says. And in general, what we really like, the end goal that we want to really enable is we want pretty fast rollups are any sort of off-chain computation, right? Like, and so essentially, we want to enable rollups to be written in things like TypeScript or Rust or whatever language that the developer is comfortable in, and so that a way that it reaches mainstream developers are also able to kind of contribute. They don't really have to learn Solidity, for example, or things like that, right? Like they can just start contributing in whatever way they want. That's when we really get to a place where, like if we have like 1,000, 10,000, 1 million developers coming into the space writing these rollup code, then like it increases the probability of breakout apps in general. Otherwise, we'll just stuck in this in this stage where there's a lot of apps being built, but there's no big breakout app still coming.
I like the vision. Yeah, I hope you'll manage to do it all. Good luck with that, and real pleasure talking to you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for answering all the questions. It was really, really interesting.
Yep. Very nice to talk to you as well. I had fun.
Thanks.